in our culture we think about nutrition and we think about weight and diet and that kind of thing. But I think our aesthetic appreciation of food is only recently kind of beginning to be given more importance.
Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Jay Weeks, PhD candidate in the Department of Agronomy. My co-host is Scott Zanona, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of science.
How often do you consider the aesthetics of your daily life? Think about the last meal you had, or perhaps you're eating right now. Were or are you fully in the presence of what you were tasting, or were you thinking about the myriad other things you had going on? In the hustle and bustle, I know I forget to stop and smell the proverbial roses. The more I think about it, it's sad, and something I try to focus on more and more. Fortunately, today, to help us better explore the art and beauty in our lives, our guest is Linda Duke. Linda is the director of the Marianna Kistler Beach Museum of Art here at Kansas State University. Formerly the director of audience engagement at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, she joined the university in June of 2011 and has worked diligently to develop the atmosphere within and opportunities to engage with the museum, while also educating students about the roles of art in our lives. Our conversation covered the ways we can think about art and how we personally experience our lives, mainly through the lens of our relationship with food. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a description of beans in this interview that really captures something we probably all could pay a little bit more attention to. Scott and John joined us as well. This talk is one where it's really up to you what you take from it, so enjoy. Linda Duke, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jay. Happy to be here.
So you came to K-State in the summer of 2011, correct?
That's right.
So what brought you here?
Actually, the chance to be the director of the Marianna Kistler Beach Museum of Art. In truth, I didn't really take it seriously when the university first contacted me. They had a search firm, and I just threw away the first few emails I got from them because I didn't think the description sounded like a good fit. But they stuck with it, and the search firm guy eventually called me and talked me into coming for an interview, and that's when I realized what a great opportunity it was.
So, what got you into art in general? Is it something that you had always enjoyed, or?
Yes, I think in our family, my brother is an artist. Our father was a commercial artist. You know, back in the days before all the technology, he illustrated products. Drew pictures of them to go into magazine ads and whatnot. And so as a family, we always went to art museums and saw art. And then I think I was struggling because I was, and I don't say this as a boast, I think it's just a weird thing that I was born with. I'm pretty good at drawing, but I also knew that I wasn't an artist in that way. And so I really anguished over that a bit as a young person. And then I started studying art history in addition to studio art and really fell in love with sharing the arts with people in that way. And I guess I'll just say one more thing, that I studied tea ceremony as a young person at university and then in graduate school.
I read about that and I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, and one of the things that a tea host does in Japanese tradition is sets up a temporary shared experience, chooses a work of art to display, chooses the incense, the tea, the sweet, the utensils that are used. And the whole thing is designed to really create a wonderful aesthetic experience for the guest or the small number of guests. And at a certain point, I realized that's what my job is in the art museum. That's exactly what I do. I'm like the tea host at the art museum. And so that's been a real privilege for me to be able to do that.
So could you say what you pay attention to then, besides the art pieces in particular, right? So the tea is about the whole experience. So how do you think about the museum that way?
Well, I think the hospitality part of it is really important to me. One of the things I felt uncomfortable with when I first came to the beach is that visitors come in the front door and the galleries aren't there. They're upstairs. And so people who haven't been there before feel a little bewildered and sometimes stumble into the offices. And so I'm really happy that we've been able to work on having student lobby hosts, and they do a wonderful job of welcoming people. And then when people get upstairs, there are more student employees to welcome them to the galleries. And so I do put a lot of importance on making people feel comfortable. Sometimes we have visitors with various kinds of disabilities, people from cultures everywhere. I always want them to feel welcomed in our space.
Is it difficult when you walk into other art galleries to take off your curatorial hat and just experience the gallery, or are you always sort of working in the back of your mind, catching things that you think are good or bad?
I don't really think of it in terms of good and bad. Oh man, I don't know how deeply to get into this, but another fortunate thing, and this is getting back to your question, believe it or not, but early in my time working in art museums, I encountered some research that was being done at the Museum of Modern Art in New York on aesthetic development, is what the researchers were calling it. So they were very interested in the kinds of thinking people do when they're trying to make meaning of an art experience. And it eventually developed into a curriculum that we teach teachers to use and to be facilitators of discussions. It's called Visual Thinking Strategies. And that really changed my professional life because it helped me in my own viewing to learn to slow down and really appreciate deep ambiguities that are often in works of art, and how provocative that is when there's a contradiction or an inconsistency, and how many thoughts that triggers. So I remain very fascinated by that process. And that really benefited me as an art viewer too when I go to museums.
Tell us more about that. What was that educational experience like? What does it mean to be a visual thinker and to take in those aesthetics and things like that?
Well, first of all, I think in our culture, even though we're awash with visual images all the time, especially now with technology, as a culture, we really privilege language as the way to communicate, as the embodiment of knowledge or the conveyor of knowledge. And for that reason, I don't think we really pay very much attention to nurturing visual thinking skills or to understanding how much variation there probably is among people. I feel that some people are, and I think there's research to back this up, are more oriented to know the world visually, and others are much stronger verbal thinkers. I went through a period when I was working at the Hammer in Los Angeles. I started asking people, how do you think? Are you conscious of thinking in words? And I was totally blown away by how many people said, of course. I had people even tell me, I even think about punctuation. And I was like, Really? Because I don't. I think a lot of people with learning differences, dyslexia and other differences from the norm, probably a high percentage of them are visual thinkers. And so I think for me, what I've loved about the VTS work is that it sets up a discussion protocol where people are constantly asked to connect what they know in a sensory way with language and to go back and forth. And so I think pedagogically, it sort of serves people at both ends of the spectrum.
So it makes them more adept or more aware of these two types of
Or
thinking?
just
Or
more
they
fluent, a stronger,
Fluent was
more
the word I was-
exercised
yes.
connection between them.
facile?
So I don't want to sort of dig too deep, like you were just saying, but there's some views about sort of thinking and cognition that I think are sort of that in the end it all has to be in some sense language based, right? You know, you don't have a proposition or a view about something unless it's kind of expressible in a sentence, right? And we've got these sort of views about visual thinking that are sort of, I mean, some of us definitely we like pictures, right? And some of us, to organize our thoughts sort of, on a page with diagrams and stuff. But, can you push more like what you actually mean by like visual thinking? Do you have a specific, way of describing it? Or is this kind of it's so open-ended that it's hard to pin down?
Well, I'm starting to feel pretty nervous here because I think
I didn't mean to do it that way. Yeah,
no. I the reason I feel nervous is because I think we're venturing into a realm where I can certainly give you my opinion based on my experience and my life work, but that's very different from the kind of scholarly knowledge that I'm suspecting you guys want in these podcasts.
No, not necessarily.
No, I mean, actually, I think personal anecdotal evidence is, and that's worthy of discussion as well, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, I am not convinced that thought is ultimately language. And I think there are some people who struggle mightily. For example, people with certain kinds of autism struggle with the lack of fluency between those two. And Temple Grandin has written about that, and I've spoken pretty extensively with her about that. There are other researchers who have said visual thinking is so quick that people are largely unaware of it. So it's not like people say, well, Tempo wrote a book called Thinking in Pictures, but most people would say, I don't know how I think. And I'm one of those people. I couldn't tell you. I know that I don't know what words I'm going to say until they come out of my mouth, unless I'm planning to say something. I can do that, but it's not my normal mode. And so I don't know, that may be too out there, but I think a lot more research needs to be done on that, because I think we waste a lot of people's lives. We waste a lot of giftedness when people are thinking in a way that's not the norm and doesn't get the support it needs as they're growing up.
Could you give an example of an exhibit or of a piece that you saw that really kind of exemplifies this?
That exemplifies
the visual thinking, and how important it is as a way of kind of thinking about the world, or just approaching it, or changing the way you view, right? Because you experienced something that you were looking at, right, and it rather than sort of thinking about it in words, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something that recently, over the last couple of years, every 3 weeks, I do a VTS seminar with veterinary pathology students. It's different students each time, unfortunately. It would be great if we had multiple sessions, but they're rotating through a 4th-year program in pathology. And so just once again, yesterday, I was with one of those groups and we were looking at an image. I always start them out with slides of images that I've chosen, and then we go upstairs and practice in the galleries, and they take turns being the facilitator. But an image that I really like to use is a painting by a man named Vernon Fisher. It's called Man Cutting Globe. And the painting is done in a style that looks kind of like a 1950s reading primer, like a Dick, Jane, and Sally book for those of us who are old enough to have learned to read that way. So black outlines, flat areas of color. Some people say it looks cartoonish. And it shows a man wearing a red polka dot tie and a white long-sleeved shirt at a table, and a little boy looking over his shoulder, watching what he's doing. And on the table is a globe. And you can see the edges of the continents. And he has his hand in a position like you would stab with a dagger. And he has some kind of tool in that hand that people debate the meaning of during the identity of that tool. And it's going into the globe. It's going into a hole that's been cut in the globe. And on the table, so there are 2 holes visible in the globe, and there are 3 pieces that look to have been cut from the globe laying on the table. And then across the bottom of this painting, there's something that looks like the periodic table, with those little rectangles that have the symbol for the element and the atomic weight and then the name of the element. And the letters of those rectangles spell out the words man cutting globe. If you look really closely, some of those are genuine elements like oxygen for O. And some of them, you're like, Trinity, is that an element? And there's another little tiny projection style map of the world up on the upper border, so tiny that most people don't even notice it. But oddly enough, the continents appear backwards, like we're seeing them from behind. So that painting fascinates me when I do it with people for the first time, because it looks like such a simple image, like a cartoon image, but it has so many things that could be visually discovered about it. The time period, probably the 40s or the 50s, the sense that there's some kind of instruction going on, or at least a demonstration between an older generation and a younger one. The reference to the elements that make up the earth, and the fact that with this kind of violent hand position, the world is being cut into, carved up in a sense like a jack-o'-lantern, and yet it's not carving a face. And so people often spend time trying to think, why are the cutouts in the places that they are? And they're all, the 2 that we can see are in the Pacific Ocean, maybe near the bottom of Japan, maybe out in the Bikini Atoll. And I say that because I know more about this artist's work. Most people never heard of him, but he did a whole series of work about the nuclear weapons that were tested in the Bikini Islands, which left them so polluted that they're still uninhabitable.
And one of the sites was called Trinity, actually.
So, see, it just goes on and on.
Yeah.
So to me, And the fact that the style of the illustration kind of dates it, but it dates it to the period when that was going on. But it also kind of coalesces into some questions about plundering the earth or using the earth, what's being taught to the next generation. So there are dozens of things that people could discover about that image if they looked at it long enough or thought about it. we usually don't. We usually look quickly, and maybe we would notice one of those things about it. And I don't know if that answers your question, but what I like about the VTS process is mostly just that it slows people down.
Yeah, I was going to ask exactly that, right? So because you said sort of a lot of times we just look and quickly, right? And a lot of people experience museums this way too, right? You kind of go through and boom, 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 right? But so say more about the value of actually just sitting and looking and experiencing.
Well, I think it's, if you're not used to it, if you haven't sort of exercised those mental or intellectual muscles, it's not so easy to do on your own. And that's the other good thing about this process. I think it uses a group process to model something that we could each do on our own. So people hear the comments from others in the class or whatever the group is, and many times they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even notice that, or I wouldn't have thought of it that way, but that's interesting. And so it kind of, the group process kind of demonstrates a critical thinking and observation process that's, I think, very valuable. And again, the fact that people are asked to find words for what they think and know, and the facilitator repeatedly asks them, what did you see that made you say that? What's the evidence? Not out of doubt, but to keep prompting that process to make someone more conscious of their own thought process. I knew it when I looked, but now I have to go back and tell you how I knew it. So it's an unpacking kind of process.
More and more we see museums that offer you the chance to have an audio guide.
Yes.
And stick something in your ears or put like, and that tends to be very just straightforward and descriptive and then move on. And do you think that that works against the kind of process that you're talking about?
Well,
do we fool ourselves by thinking that's enough?
I do, in the sense that I think it's easy to be in a passive mode and just listen to that and have someone tell you what you're seeing and what's important about it. They're not going to tell you why it should matter to you. You're the only one who can do that. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not wild about that. Although we do offer Smartify in the museum. People can download an app where if they want more information about something, they can just point their phone at it and get it. But at least it's not a droning tour that there has to be more choice and action involved.
So one of the things that we talked about a little bit as far as taking some time to experience, what you're doing in the moment. I noticed this while I was actually getting ready for this interview today. I was eating my lunch and I was reading the description you gave about the aesthetics of food and how we often, don't necessarily pay attention to everything. And I realized that as I was eating my salad, I wasn't even tasting my salad because I was concentrating on the reading, right?
Perfect, Jay.
And I wanted to get into the aesthetics of food and how important that is, not only for enjoying the food itself, but for appreciating where food comes from and all of that and the connections that we can make. So I'll let you take it from here about your thoughts on that regard.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a huge topic. I feel like, I think I told you in an email, Jay, that I see the art museum and to some extent my role as being one of connector. I think the arts are a big enough tent that a lot of disciplines can benefit from participating in the arts. And I feel the same way about food. I feel that it is such a squandered or underutilized resource for education, period, at all levels. Because I think, just like we were talking about VTS and bringing to consciousness, bringing to language, and that's really what you were talking about, bringing thought to language, if it wasn't originally language. Bringing that sensory experience to language can be a really important thing for people to be fluent at. And I think we could start in early childhood. Kids eat snack at school. They eat lunch at school. And there are people like Alice Waters, of course, with her edible schoolyard project and all that, who have known that for years. And kids grow gardens and cook food together at school and talk about it and write about it and measure it and all of that. But I think it's just as true at university. I mean, what do we teach here at K-State that couldn't in some way be related to food? And maybe if we could do a better job of making people more conscious of that, maybe it would also change the status of food in our culture, because I feel like, well, from my travels abroad, I feel like Americans sometimes don't demand or expect the food that they're served to be as good as people in other cultures often do. That, if we travel, we expect that we might have to eat something subpar in a bus station or an airport. And that's not always true every place in the world. I feel like in our culture, we think about nutrition and we think about weight and diet and that kind of thing. But I think our aesthetic appreciation of food is only recently kind of beginning to be given more importance. And I think that's a really important thing to happen. But it's only one of the things. I mean, there's the science. There's all of this that needs to be better appreciated and better understood.
Yeah, I mean, we've really, well, at least historically, have focused on the quantification of things, right? When we have sort of neglected the more qualitative aspects of food and things like that way. So what do you think, if you were going to be delving into a college course or something like that, or you're teaching a college course, what would you change? How would you start to integrate some of these ideas into practice?
Well, I mean, it would depend on what you were teaching. I think this is a topic that needs the leadership of the university as an organization. I think because I think faculty have to be given the support they need and the sense of the importance of teaching in ways that connect with other disciplines and helping students think in that way. So I don't know, there are a lot of ways, and I think some of them do involve just this issue of science communication or communication period, the relationship between experience and knowledge and language, and being better at using language. I brought something in case it seemed like it would be worth it. It's a footnote or an end note from one of the articles I sent to you, Jay. I think I told you that I had an opportunity a few years ago to spend a month at the American Academy in Rome, which is a site that's dedicated to interdisciplinary conversation and stimulation. I had, not long before that, I had gotten to do a little project with Alice Waters, the chef I mentioned, and she had recently helped the American Academy completely redo their food program, because to save money, they had started getting cheaper and cheaper food and putting less money into paying their kitchen staff and all of that. And the food got bad to the point where a lot of the fellows and Rome Prize winners and all the creative people who were staying in residence there started eating at the local restaurants instead of. And that's when they realized that the heart of the academy was the table. It was that shared experience of eating food together and the kinds of ideas people talked about over meals. And they brought Alice in to help them reinvent. the whole academy, really, in a sense, because that was the heart of it. And I was so impressed by what she told me about that. I decided when I went to the academy that I would interview people about their aesthetic experiences with food, but with the more standard aesthetic experiences that people think of, like paintings or architecture or music or whatever. And so that's what I did. I spent a month with a little digital recorder, and I got, these famous writers and artists and musicians and the kitchen staff and the gardeners. I would just interview anybody who would talk to me about aesthetic experience. And I was really impressed by how many of them chose to talk about food. I really was struck by that.
And you just asked about aesthetic experience in general,
exactly.
And then you started talking
Yeah.
about
They
food.
Yes,
food.
yes, they could pick anything.
Well, there is this entire literature of people talking about food in different ways. There's a writer named A.J. Liebling, who was famous in the New Yorker quite a while, wrote an entire book that was based on a year that he spent as a student in Paris, and it was all around eating, all around food. And it's really quite
That's
spectacular.
what I'm telling you. In
James
other
Beard.
places, this idea of the aesthetics of food being important is a little more advanced than we have had it here. I think that's...
Is it because we've always just focused on price and like what happened at the institute you're describing? Because they wanted to cut costs because of low budgets or something like that, so they cut a little bit out and a little bit out and a little bit out before there's nothing left. Or why do you think that is? Why do other cultures value it so much more than maybe we do?
I mean, I think there are probably a lot of reasons, but maybe one of them is that it's a sensory experience, and as I said, I think our culture tends a little toward the puritanical and doesn't value things that we know through the senses as much as things that we know through language.
Well, and there's a utilitarian aspect to that, to pragmatic, like sort of so you want the thing to serve a certain purpose, right? And
yes.
the purpose is like feed, nourish,
exactly,
whatever, right?
energy,
And sort of just,
refreshing my
get
body.
that part and get it as
It's
quickly
fuel,
and
that's all
efficiently
it
as
is.
Exactly.
possible. Right?
Yeah. And I mean, there are other things. There's the rush of something that's very sweet, or the addictiveness of something that's salty. I mean, we have those too, but backing off and taking the time to really cherish food and value it is, I don't think it's been a real strong theme in our culture, but I feel like it's starting to come up now, and I think that's a good thing.
Do you think it has something to do too with how our culture has framed health, and the things that are really sweet and really really full of fat or something like that, or really savory, have often been considered unhealthy, even though the science now is kind of debates that in some respects, especially considering fats. Do you think that's why we've shied away from some of that kind of stuff, or what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I guess again, I would say we've explored the issue through words rather than through experience, through received knowledge, received information about what our bodies need, and been maybe less attuned to how food feels when we eat it. I don't know. I think there's a lot. I think it's complicated.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, right? And rather than trusting yourself to dictate, what you should be eating and what tastes good and what feels good and all of that kind of stuff, we've relied on an outside source.
I think there's even been some really interesting research more recently about how different diets, with different ratios of fat and protein and carbohydrates, how there's quite a variation in terms of how an individual person thrives on one diet or another, that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
Right. And I think it's interesting now what we're seeing, I mean, with a lot of these diets, there's a lot of still looking at how much protein are you getting versus how many carbs and gluten and it's very much not how you're thinking about food at all, right? In terms of the sensory experience, right? But at the same time, we have this birth of all kinds of like fancy coffee shops and sort of microbreweries and, you know, better restaurants. So this is happening at the same time, right? So it's like a little bit of maybe we're going in both directions at once as a culture, right?
Yeah, and I'm certainly not saying that nutrition studies aren't important. I think that's hugely important and interesting. I'm just pointing out that I think we haven't, as a popular culture, we haven't been in touch with our bodies when it comes to food.
So what do you want? I mean, what do you think we need then? Like, how do you, sort of what would you want? Like maybe just, Jay mentioned college students, but like kids, what would you tell younger kids sort of in terms of how they're thinking about food or how they're approaching eating?
I don't think it's so much a matter of telling them as what kinds of experiences you create for them. And, you know, I mean, as I said, I think Alice Waters and the Edible Schoolyard program has been thinking about that, you know, kids sharing food experiences and talking about it and writing about it. You know, I mean, this is getting way off topic maybe, but I was just talking with someone the other day about parents having battles with their children about food where, you know, and I experienced that as a child myself. You can't leave the table until you've finished that glass of milk or whatever. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like young children need to get the message that we do respect how they feel about food in their bodies, and that they should never have to eat or drink something that they don't want to. If they're picky eaters when they're little, I guess my own experience as a parent tells me it takes care of itself. I had one adventurous eater and two picky eaters, and they're all adventurous eaters now, so it didn't matter.
Yeah, and it's also been hypothesized that children's ability to discriminate different flavors and intensities changes.
Yes.
So they go through a period where everything is just way too everything. So that's why they want macaroni and cheese and
exactly
the like.
And so what's gained by forcing them to eat something that they don't
like
enjoy
in the first place, right? Takes care of itself. We took some friends to a restaurant with a French. It was a very nice French restaurant, and they took their 7-year-old along, and we thought this is going to be quite the battle. And he ordered the mussels, and we didn't, and the snails, and we didn't get one of them. So just
children vary quite a bit.
They do indeed.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I mean, there's a lot of factors there, but I think one thing that you mentioned is, you know, giving them experiences too, right? And I was wondering if you'd say more about that notion that you were talking about before with VTS, with visual thinking, putting words to sort of what you're experiencing, because that's a major challenge in all aesthetic experience, right? So I think it's a challenge people have with food, you know, too, right? Sort of, there's a taste you like, but like, how would you describe it?
Exactly.
Or what is it doing to you? So, like, what do you have to say about like that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The man who was my tea ceremony teacher when I was in graduate school is going to be coming here and doing a program for the museum in October, and October 24th, actually. And yeah, I just lost my train of thought there. Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, so it was about putting words to your experiences, right? And sort of how challenging that is, and I don't know, how just how that relates to visual thinking, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the things that tea ceremony ingrains in people is this sense of being present in the moment. In fact, there's a saying that often is hung as a calligraphy scroll in the tea practice room that reads Ichigo Ichie, which kind of means one time, one chance. It's sort of like this moment will never come again. So that sense that the tea ceremony as an art practice is trying to give people a moment to really notice what's happening right now, right this minute. And one of the rules, if you will, of tea ceremony is that you don't discuss anything while you're in the tea ceremony that doesn't have to do with what's happening right now. You're not going to talk about politics or the weather, but you can talk about the taste, the texture, the sound of the bamboo scoop hitting on the side of the tea bowl, those sensory things that are happening right now. And so it's a kind of, again, a mental exercise for being in the present, which is probably the most difficult, uncomfortable place for our attention to stay. We're always going backwards or forwards, but to be right here. I think Ram Dass wrote a book called Be Here Now.
Well, and to some extent, I guess our culture tries to do things like that. Being served wine.
That's what I was just going to say, and
would be
back
one.
to your
carving the turkey, haggis, the ceremony of the haggis in Scotland and the like.
Yes, and people. That's why I was thinking of my teacher when you asked me about language. It's the language of wine or the language of tea. If any of you have ever been to a Chinese tea shop, I had the experience of going there with two tea experts one time, and so the tea host was, this was Chinese tea, pour the water over the tea in a little cup, and my friend would taste it, and then he would say something like, I'm thinking it's the such and such farm in Assam, and I'm thinking it was the spring before last, and the west side of the hill. And I was like, are you kidding me? But that's how wine people are too.
Yes.
But that's like a super intense version of being able to bring this stuff to language.
And that actually can have the opposite effect sometimes for people trying to get into this, right? Because it's sort of there's all this elite knowledge, right?
Right, exactly.
So I think it's important.
It's easy to make fun of that.
And it's easy to be, I guess, put off, right, or challenged by it, right? Sort of, but when you're talking, I mean, I think something you've said something about is, how much you want the aesthetics, right, the art experience, whether it's food or whether it's visual art or whatever else, to be open, right, and not to have these barriers, right? So
yes.
I don't know. Could you say more about like what it takes to sort of enter into a museum and experience?
Well, that's
things?
very, very relevant, because I think in this country, in the U.S., we've kind of made art history knowledge be the qualification for enjoying visual art. We've made people, unintentionally maybe, but we've made people feel like if they don't know very much about art and art history, they probably should keep their mouths shut in the museum. And then we've tried to make them feel better, but also shut them up by giving them an audio tour and telling them what they ought to know about what they're looking at, what they should have thought. And so we haven't respected beginner experiences with aesthetics, but everybody has aesthetic experiences, and it's not like beginners is less valuable than experts, and yet we've belittled that, or we haven't paid attention to it. And that was the other thing about the VTS research that really moved me when I first learned about it, that it totally blew that out of the water and said, this is worthwhile. Whatever people can do if they stop and think and notice is important. It has value. It's even deeply moving. And I know that as a facilitator, because when I hear people speak their own truths in front of works of art, I mean, sometimes it's very moving, and it can be such a simple thing that they noticed, but their effort to put it into words is more poetic than I could have ever made it. And that kind of brings us back around to teaching, because you were asking about teaching about food. I think the VTS work absolutely promotes the idea that you as the teacher need to take responsibility when your teaching doesn't work and not blame the learner. I don't know. I think sometimes it's painful to hear someone who's burnt out on teaching and they're saying, the students nowadays, you just can't get their attention. And VTS, the philosophy behind that doesn't give any credibility to that. It's take responsibility. If you're the teacher and what you're doing isn't working, find a way to meet them where they are. For some reason, you're not meeting them where they are. And so I think that principle of meeting the learner where they are, whether it's in the arts or in some other subject.
Was it an emphasis on growth mindset and
Yes.
teaching and learning as being learning as being an experience rather than just trying to get to the right answer?
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
I do think that's something that we need to focus on more, is that not everybody is going to, be at the same place and be able to get, like all the biochemical pathways or something like that, right? But
Exactly.
it's the experience of learning that is really what's going to serve a lot of students rather than, what they remember from X class.
Well,
right?
and the thing is, the biochemical pathways, they might be difficult or even impossible to learn if you don't have your own reason for wanting to know them. And so it's more about when you give people information than it is about giving them information. Of course, we want to give them information, but we sometimes dump it on people and then we complain that they couldn't remember it or they mixed it up. But we didn't create a situation where they needed it.
So speaking of visual and learning, I listened to a podcast on Sean Carroll's Mindscape the other day, and I'm going to forget the lady's name, but she was talking about how mythology has been passed down in oral traditions, and some of the ways in which some of these really long stories were remembered and passed down was that the person responsible for curating that knowledge actually associated certain ideas with certain places.
Yes.
I think they called it something palace, mental palace or something like that, and they associated this aspect of the story with this part of a building, and then they would walk around the building to help them remember each part of the story rather
the room,
than just
the cornice, the book in the corner. Yes.
Yeah. Are you familiar with that sort of literature or that sort of teaching style, and what do you think about that?
Well, I'm only familiar with it that I know that in indigenous cultures in this country, but probably in others as well, often had stories associated with land features. And so there was a sense of history and mythology and origin stories and all of that being very tied to geographic features and places. So it seems very similar.
Yeah, and it made me wonder. And
you're talking about more as a memory technique.
as a memory tool, but also as a way of learning things as a system too.
Right.
Right. Rather than just remembering this follows this follows this. In pure abstraction, that you could sort of walk around your house and then visit that when you needed to recall.
Yeah.
A certain part of it, and be like, oh, I associated this with the dresser or whatever.
Right.
Which sounds kind of crazy if you haven't experienced it, but it made a lot of sense when she explained it. So I thought it was really interesting. Getting back to some of the work you did. With the food aesthetics and things, were there any favorite descriptions that you had? I wanted to try to capture you because you brought some of the notes from that, right?
I had a short quote that I pulled out from one of those interviews, and it really struck me because this woman is an award-winning art historian and scholar. And when I asked her to talk about an aesthetic experience, she not only chose food, but she chose to talk about the beans that had been served at lunch. And I just thought I would read this short quote. I was quite amazed. So she said, I'm going to talk about my aesthetic experiences with food here, beginning with today's lunch, in particular the beans. I feel a little bit like when I talk about food, food is something that I'm very interested in, but it's a different sort of aesthetic experience from what I'm used to with visual aesthetics. And sometimes I feel like words fail me, but I'm not willing to let them fail me because talking about this stuff is what I do in aesthetic terms. So let's see what we can get. I think the key to the bean dish today was the contrast in texture between the sort of smooth and creamy beans, which were, with the bean is some sort of grain to it, especially when you are cooking from dried beans. As you bite into it, you can sense different gradations of that. But in these, it was so perfectly cooked that there was no gradient or real texture. It really had this consistent smoothness to it. There was like a balance going on there in terms of not just texture, but you have that kind of mellow, almost a nuttiness to the sort of mellow, buttery, nutty bean flavor. And the same thing with the bread, which is another mellow flavor, contrasted with the sharpness and bitterness and acidity of the tomato and the chard. So it's like the entire dish is about contrasts. It was fun.
Yes.
That's an amazing quote.
Yes.
People who know me know I love beans, so I really appreciated that one too.
So we don't think about our food that often at that kind of level, do
No,
we? Or
no,
ever,
we don't.
right? I mean, so yeah.
Yeah. And it could feel silly. She felt a little embarrassed
Yeah.
almost to launch into this. But it was her truth. She did know those things about the lunch.
Sure.
And cooking, right? Sort of some, good cooking shows will try to talk you through some of these things too, right? And so this is something you think about, right? If you try to learn the art of cooking or learn to try to create experiences like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I came across a quote from Dwight Furrow. He does a blog called Edible Arts. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
But he said, when he was referring to preparing a meal and things, he said the idea is not merely to create a fantastic concoction or to add a new flavor note to a dish. It is to capture the essence of something that has hitherto gone unnoticed and to impress upon the diner that there is something here to be explored and understood.
Oh, how great.
Yeah,
That's
and I thought that was
really
a
wonderful.
really interesting way to capture,
I love
everything that
that.
goes along with food.
Yeah. Yeah, and you could almost say the same thing about a visual art experience.
So what do you have to say about art and food? So you've been talking about sort of the art of food, right? But how about the combination of like visual art and food or other things like that? Do you have many thoughts about how food has shown up in visual art or how it's showing up today in works?
Yeah. Well, like I said, in history, tea ceremony has been a practice that has involved a tea ceremony meal and all the cooking arts that go with it. There are some artists who have done really interesting work. Like I'm thinking, I'm trying to remember his name. There's a West Coast artist, Lee Mingwei, I think is his name, who did a whole series of hospitality projects. And I remember one of them was he had a little miniature efficiency apartment set up in the gallery of an art museum. It might have been the Whitney. And visitors could sign up to spend the night in that little efficiency apartment with Lee Mingwei, and he would prepare dinner for them. And so there were 2 little beds, and there was a little eating area and a kitchen, and he would fix this food for them.
Could people watch them interacting and him preparing the food and all that?
I can't remember that part.
Well, that tradition comes into the U.S. in the chef's table, where for a little more money you can actually get a table in the kitchen and watch Alice Waters or whoever do that, and they will come over and they will talk about the food in those terms. They will share their aesthetic with it. It's really quite fun.
That's interesting. Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
How cool.
Not with not at Chez Panisse, but
yeah.
at some other. I'm kind of a foodie.
Oh, wow.
Get down to it.
Well, what I think we've been touching on several times throughout this discussion, when talking about the tea ceremonies or the chef's table or anything like that, is just how profoundly social food is as an art, right? How all of these things always come back to sitting how important it is to enjoying that things if you're sitting at a table with a bunch of people talking about it and that sort of thing, right? And maybe today, although I do think that it's changing along with the appreciation of higher quality food and things like that, but people are going back to just having dinner together at a table,
yes,
right?
Yes.
As opposed to like me today eating my lunch and not tasting my salad, right? So yeah, I think that's important. I don't know if anybody has anything more to say about that, but it's just something that it seems very deeply human to share food as a social experience.
It very much is, and there have been studies that have been conducted that have been funded by food companies actually looking at outcomes where families it's made easier for them to eat as a group, as a family. And then, further on down the line, they would look at other sorts of outcomes from that. And it's very clear that that's positive, not negative.
Interesting. Well, Linda, we want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you'd like to talk about or you'd like to touch on?
Feels like we've covered a lot of ground to me.
John, Scott, do you have anything?
No, it's fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, hey, Linda, we really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Great, and we look forward to checking in again.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, drop us an email or check out our website at kstate.edu/research/global food. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.